years. So this was made in San Francisco. But go ahead, ask.
No, please.
Oh, no, I was gonna say, the thing you have to remember about this is, this was in the late seventies and early eighties, right? And all this, and Andy was a big star back then. Taxi was a huge hit. Andy was a big star. And he would go back and do the stuff in Memphis, and it wasn't on cable. No one knew he was doing this except the people in Memphis. He just did it for himself and for the people in Memphis. No one ever saw this until we made I'm from Hollywood. So that just shows you how dedicated he was.
The footage you see when they're in the TV studio was
Yeah.
like local
Saturday
20
show.
people that just showed around Memphis. It wasn't like that show.
Oh yeah, it was just in Memphis. It was like the local public television or something, you know? I mean, it was not broadcast anywhere but Memphis.
So what was, you told the story before you traveled home, you actually followed home after one of the matches, but what was it like? You were there for a lot of 1983 with him during that.
Yeah.
What was that like?
They really hated him. They really did. And you know, I mean, really and truly, this was him being a bad guy wrestler. That was not what Andy was like. He didn't hate women. You know, all of that stuff about sending him back to the kitchen. It was just him being a bad guy wrestler because he loved this wrestler from the 50s and 60s who was Nature Boy Buddy Rogers. And that's the kind of stuff that Buddy Rogers used to say. So, and that was all part of his act, but they hated him, especially after that toilet paper stuff. I mean, it was, so one night, he would hide out in his dressing room after the matches. He had to wait till Lawler left, he had to wait till everyone left, and then we'd go out to the car. It was the only car in the parking lot. And one time someone followed us, you know, some headlights came on, and they started following us, and Andy's like, oh shit, and he drove straight, he was a chicken, he drove straight to the police station. You know? And people would see him at the restaurant, you know, we'd be out in the restaurants and stuff, and if you're someplace else, people would like want his autograph or talk to him, and they would just go, oh, you shouldn't say that stuff about us, we hate you. And it's like, oh, thank you very much. And then he was doing he was doing the job correctly. The more they hated him, the better he was at what he was doing.
And I'll say one thing real quick, and then if there's questions, please just shout them out. But one thing we were talking about before is if you watch Man on the Moon, which is the Milos Forman film, when they show the wrestling footage and they recreate it, they make it seem like it's some big thing and there's flames shooting out of the turnbuckle. But when you see this, you see what it really was like
What it was really
blood-dried mats and.
Yeah, it's the real McCoy. I mean, that was the Mid-South Coliseum was big. It's not there anymore. When you were saying you'll never see this again, they've torn it down. You know, none of this exists anymore. And we would drive around and go to the small matches that were at high schools and stuff, you know. It's just, that world of wrestling does not exist anymore.
So any questions, any thoughts? Yeah, please.
So back in the early 80s, it was still kayfabe, and
There was what?
kayfabe, it was like still, everything was still.
Oh, yeah.
So how did Andy break into the industry, and how much training did he have before he started, you know, wrestling?
Did you guys hear all that? None. I mean, he had no training. And what he said was he really realized that he couldn't wrestle men, so he would wrestle women, you know, but he watched wrestling from the time he was a kid, you know, but then when he got in the ring, I mean, he really did get hurt a lot, because you see some of that stuff, and I mean, he got beat up because he didn't know how to land like the wrestlers do, you know, he didn't know how to take punches. Yeah.
And he originally, for anyone, some of you may know this, but he originally had tried to do this act, but in New York, and he had approached, so Vince McMahon, who we all know, his father was actually preceded him as the kind of guru of New York. And Andy had approached him originally and tried to do this in Madison Square Garden. And they said they didn't want him because they thought people would think it was fake and that he would ruin wrestling.
Yeah, they think it was fake.
So he could only do it in Memphis. He had it through a connection. He was
A connection said, you know, why don't you go to try Memphis? And Jerry Lawler went, yeah, come to Memphis, you know. But they wouldn't have him in New York. And then the funny thing is like the year after Andy died, they've got Cyndi Lauper being a manager.
That's exactly right. And had this happened a year later, he would have certainly been in New York. They would have never turned him down.
No, yeah, but I'm so glad it happened this way because it's so authentic, you know. Because wrestling these days is like, I don't find it all that interesting anymore. Like you said, sorry to any professional wrestlers out there, but it's just, it's too big, it's too fancy, you know? It's just, it's doesn't have that hometown feeling anymore.
There was another question, I think.
Oh, you guys answered it. I was gonna ask why Memphis.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think probably had he lived, I suspect he may have traveled to other places too.
Well, he had planned to, yeah, because, I mean, we were living in San Francisco, by the way. I don't know if you knew that, because I came up to San Francisco from LA for an editing job and then never left. So Andy moved up here with me. And I just remember being up here because his career really was, after the wrestling, no one wanted to hire him anymore. Not just the wrestling, but a lot of the stuff he was doing, no one wanted to hire him. So he said, oh, well, maybe I'll be a wrestling manager now. So that was his plan, was he wanted to be a manager of someone, I don't know who, but.
You'd have found somebody.
I was just curious, like, you were doing an interview with Robin Williams in a trailer or an apartment or anything, kind of on location. And obviously, as the story goes on, we can tell he's having a little bit of fun with it. Had he ever seen Andy wrestle or any of this, or
No,
did you just talk to him a little bit about it, he ripped it off the top?
he only knew about the women wrestling,
Yeah.
you know? And what was so funny, when I edited this, I was really worried that adding Robin too much was gonna give it all away, that he was, but didn't seem to, you know? Like I was admitting it was all a joke. But Robin was hysterical, and he just went off on that by himself, of course. We didn't prompt him, you know? When he needed money for a match, we could tell.
You did wrestle at home though.
Oh, yeah, he had a wrestling match at home, yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of going, thinking about being wrestling manager and stuff, was he trying to do stuff locally around these areas, or was he trying to?
He wasn't thinking of anywhere at the time, you know? It's just, that was his thought, that was his next step, because they didn't want him in Hollywood anymore. So he'd be a wrestling manager, but it never went beyond that because then he got sick. So, but I'm sure that's what he would have done, is start traveling around as a wrestling manager.
Because it's not too long after the end of this movie that he was too really sick to do anything.
Oh, I was gonna tell you how it ended. That's right. Or should we?
No,
more
well,
questions?
Go
Okay,
ahead.
we started planning this together. He was still alive. He didn't know he was gonna be sick, you know. So it was in mid-1983, and we started putting it together. We put together an outline. So the whole thing was supposed to be that there's a documentary filmmaker who finds Andy in the Tenderloin here in San Francisco, because he's gone nuts, you know, and he's got no career anymore, and they find him in this dingy apartment in the Tenderloin. And so this was all gonna be in flashback. And then the end of the movie, I don't know if you've ever seen, Andy's favorite movie was A Face in the Crowd with Andy Griffith. And the end of that film is Andy Griffith is kind of nuts, and he's screaming, you know, like, and it pulls back. And so what we planned to do is Andy was gonna be like in Union Square, screaming at the top, I am not crazy, I'm from Hollywood, and pull back till he's this little guy, you know, that was gonna be the end of the documentary. So basically, we just cut that stuff out, and the rest of it was really the way we had planned to make it.
I was curious, your book you were talking about, do you, what era does it cover? Like what time period, and do you have copies for sale?
Thank you.
We're supposed to talk about me.
Yeah, we're talking about later. But yes, I do have copies. Funny you should ask. There are copies for sale. And it covers about roughly 1880 to 1940, which again is like the era when all this was invented.
Pre-TV.
Pre-TV,
Yeah.
exactly. It stops right at the beginning of essentially when TV comes in. When wrestling was exclusively a live experience, then it kind of becomes a TV and a live experience, and it's kind of a
Yeah,
hybrid.
Andy had spent his whole childhood watching wrestling.
And
New
if you-
York
If
wrestling.
you have Hulu and look for, there's a Saturday Night Live in 1979 where he actually brings Buddy Rogers
Oh,
to
I don't know.
Saturday Night Live. as his manager to wrestle women on Saturday night.
That woman who was a professional wrestler, yeah. But he always cheated, by the way, because Bob Zamuda, you know, who you saw on here, that was Andy's best friend and writer, and he was always his referee. And so they just cheated, because a lot of the women could beat Andy. You know? And so whenever they were beating him, Zamuda would be like off arguing with someone or something, you know, so they never won.
What was the relationship between Jerry Lawler and Andy? Were they in on it together?
That's always a tough question, because I don't like to say, what's that word you said? Yeah. So I just, you know, it's wrestling, man.
All right.
If you talk down the movie, you can't believe everything you see in a movie.
But go watch the Letterman footage on YouTube when you go.
Oh,
watch
yeah,
it. If you
Letterman.
don't know the Letterman footage, go watch
They
it.
wouldn't let us use it, so.
Curious if you and Andy ever went to the Holy City Zoo here.
Yes.
Yeah.
We used to go there, yeah. In fact, we went a couple times when Robin was performing.
Right.
Yeah, because Robin wasn't even huge back then. You know, he was getting huge, but he was still performing there. Yeah, funny you would mention that. We went quite a few times.
So what was the venue for the
Oh,
venue?
the Holy City Zoo, is it still there?
No,
No.
it was closed in like the late 80s, maybe early 90s.
It's called the Scarlet Lounge now.
It's what?
It's called the Scarlet Lounge now.
It's the Scarlet Lounge, but it was a comedy club back then. So yeah, we went there a lot. You didn't know Andy did you?
How'd you find the music? The song was really funny.
The Bobs. The Bobs are another their San Francisco group. I mean, I don't know if they're around anymore, but they were a San Francisco a cappella group. Yeah. Yeah, it's good, isn't it, that music? It's really funny.
What was the time frame from his first match down there to the end of the movie?
The first match in Memphis?
Yeah.
The first ones were in 1982. He started in 1982, and then, I mean, he was up right until the last minute when he got sick, which was the end of 1983.
Okay, so it was about a year.
Yeah.
This program happened.
Yeah, and he just kept going. I mean, there's a lot that's not in here. I mean, he went back over and over. I mean, like, we were laughing by the time you saw the matches, there was no one there anymore. They're like, oh, it's Andy Kaufman.
Right.
You
I always
know?
think it's kind of sad because you can see him coughing in one of the.
Yeah.
And that was.
Because he had lung cancer, and on the Jerry Lawler show, which
Yeah.
cracks me up because,
Right.
you know, he's like,
Right.
oh yeah, the Jerry Lawler show.
One, for historic value, where in San Francisco did Andy Kaufman reside, neighborhood, block?
Live.
I'm sorry.
We lived, the main place we lived was at the very top. You go up Castro Hill to the top, and then you go up more, and it's a street called Collingwood.
Yeah.
The very tippy top of Collingwood was our apartment, yeah.
And he loved Orphan Andy's, right?
What's that?
He loved Orphan
Orphan
Andy's.
Andy's. Yeah, there was this rumor running around that he was gay because he was always down in the Castro, there was Mrs. Fields, chocolate chip cookies, and we always went to Little Orphan Andy's, and there was another 24-hour place, which I can't think of right now, in the Castro.
On Church.
Sparky's.
Sparky's, yes, that was it, yeah. So he was always sitting around the Castro. All my gay friends thought, oh, of course he was gay, you know?
So you mentioned that Andy kept going back multiple times to Memphis and stuff like that, and, you know, primarily working with Lawler and working with, you know, Jimmy Hart and stuff like that. How did the other people in the locker room kind of take to him, or like Jared and stuff like that?
Jared was one of the big, he might have been the one who brought him to Memphis,
Yeah.
wasn't
He owned Memphis.
Yeah.
He owned the promotion.
Yeah, so he brought him to Memphis, and all the other wrestlers I met, they loved him, you know, and he brought business.
Exactly.
They all got it. But he did wait in the he always would wait in his dressing room until Lawler left. I would have to go out and watch him drive away.
Did he have his own did he have his own locker room? Or
No.
Was he common with the rest of everybody?
Oh, wait, no, he did, he had a private room.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were in a private room, yeah. Yeah.
Safety wise more than anything, you think, or?
I don't know, I didn't realize that not all wrestlers didn't have private rooms. Never occurred to me.
It did bring an awful lot of attention. I spoke years ago to a wrestler from that area, and they had said that this may not mean a lot to everybody, but you were seeing with Ric Flair, who a lot of people may know Ric Flair, but he was a touring champion back then, and it's something he hadn't been to Memphis in 10 years or something like that. But after the Letterman episode, he came there the next week and was on TV, and everybody knew Memphis was getting a lot of national attention at that time.
Right.
So it did bring a lot of attention to the
But just for that moment,
just for that moment.
when he got when he got dropped on his head, and after that, no one knew that Andy went back to Memphis.
That's, yeah.
Over and over.
Could you paint a bit more of a picture of sort of the end, sort of the end of the time wrestling in Memphis and when he got sick? It's like, how long since he'd been sort of the working actor working in TV? Like, I just kind of missing a bit of the picture of the end.
It was very close because, let's see, like Taxi was canceled in '83, I think.
Yeah, no, I recently constructed this timeline. But
Yeah,
yes,
I
it was
used to
canceled.
I used to go to Taxi with him. He was still going to Memphis and stuff. And like that stuff that he said where you saw him coughing on the Lawler show, that would have been like in October, say, of '83. He discovered he had cancer in December of '83. So he was actually there wrestling in October, and his arm was already, we didn't realize that he had a tumor in his arm. And I watched that footage and I go, how did he not break his arm? And he had been, the TV shows had dried up because of all the other, we won't even get into all the other stuff he did, like on Fridays, and I mean, everyone was worried about he got in a big fight with Michael Richards on Friday, which was all set up.
There's a lot.
There's a lot.
In 1982, with the pile driver, first time in '82, but it's interesting about Saturday Night Live, they voted him off the show.
Right, then
so
they voted him off Saturday Night Live.
There was a national poll of calling people who watched the show.
Let me just talk about that real quick, this was another setup, because Andy was doing all the stuff with the wrestling women and stuff like that, so they had a poll, like, should we kick Kaufman off the air? And Dick Ebersol, they were doing it as a joke. Dick Ebersol and Andy were doing it as a joke. They knew he would get voted off the air. And then the plan was to have Andy sneak back on the show, like it's Tony Clifton or something like that, and go, ha ha ha, rip off the mask, I'm back. And Dick Ebersol double-crossed him completely, never had him back on. So everyone just believed it was real, and it wasn't. And that really, Andy was, that was very disappointing to say the least. But it added to the belief that Andy had ruined his career and, was on the skids, which Andy didn't mind at all. He didn't mind. He said, he also said, maybe I'll be a writer, because he was writing a book, I'll be a writer from now on, It didn't.
Seems like such a brief period.
Doesn't it?
It's just, I don't know, it would have been amazing to see what happened.
Yeah, just the wrestling was from, the wrestling with the women was in the late 80s, late 70s into the 80s. I'm not quite sure the date he started wrestling.
I always put it around 1979. It starts in like 78, 79, I think.
So that's stuff and he did that in college campuses all over the country. He was wrestling women all over the place.
Hundreds of them, yeah. And I will put a plug in, she wrote a fabulous book called Dear Andy Kaufman, I Hate Your Guts.
Dear Andy Kaufman, I Hate Your Guts.
Of women that sent in Polaroids.
And letters challenging him to wrestle.
And she compiled them into a book, and I think you actually have all of them, right? Do you still have
I
them?
donated them. Yes, they're all in a collection that's supposed to go into a museum one of these days, but who knows if
It's an amazing
But it was a
book.
box this full. It was a huge box of letters.
Of women writing in, essentially challenging
With these
him.
pictures, like, I could get you Kaufman,
It's pretty amazing.
One quick addition, just like, the women, was it all real, or was any of that set up? Like,
Some of it is set up, like for instance, on Saturday Night Live, a friend of his, Mimi, was one of the ones who wrestled on Saturday Night Live, but I'd say 98% of it was all just real women. When it comes to like Saturday Night Live, of course, they wanted to control it more, but a lot of that footage was from Merv Griffin. He wrestled on Merv Griffin. He would wrestle on airplanes.
He wore that neck brace everywhere. That's amazing too. If you watch when he goes around, Merv Griffin, he has that neck brace on. He wears it on Saturday Night Live.
It was filthy.
He stole that. Susan was not real, the woman that he wrestles. The 320-pound woman that he wrestles.
Oh, yeah, that
I
was,
think
that was
was
someone's
set.
secretary, that was set up.
You mentioned, so the book goes to the 40s.
Oh.
Is there a ballot part two in the works?
We've been talking about it.
Talks about like when all this exciting stuff happened and also kind of the peak of, well, in my mind, of, that kind of wrestling, which would have been the 80s for me. Do you have that?
It's your book.
We're talking, we were debating if.
We were discussing, I say yes, the history of wrestling throughout the US.
It's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work, it's a lot of
I'll
work.
be 80 and I'm.
Yeah.
That's my wife.
Get to it, buddy.
Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between Andy and Bob Zamuda, where one began and one ended, or?
Good, that's a good way of putting it, where one began and one ended, because, Bob met Andy very early in Andy's career, very early, back when Andy was performing in New York, and they became fast friends. Then they separated for a while, because that's when Andy got on Saturday Night Live, he moved out to LA, and Bob was still in New York, but it was very early on that Andy brought Bob back in, which was when he did his special on ABC, which was like 78, I think. And they were just the best, but Bob became one of my dearest friends, and Bob is just, it's hard to say where Andy starts and Bob, well, you know what I mean? Because Bob is just hysterically funny, and he's brilliant, and he just thinks of the most, he's so much fun, and Andy was so much fun, and he and Bob were like kids in a candy store, they were just in cahoots for all those years. And I was telling John tonight that I think the only reason that Andy and I got together is because in 1982, Bob went off and wrote a film called DC Cab for Joel Schumacher. And so Andy didn't have Bob around, and that's when he met me. I think I became Bob. But Bob is just, I just love him. We're still friends after all these years. He's still one of my dearest friends.
Not to ruin it, but he was Tony Clifton.
Many times. Yeah, if you know Tony Clifton, you saw Tony Clifton here, and the joke was that Andy started being Tony Clifton, but then everyone started saying, oh, we know Tony Clifton is Andy Kaufman, that's not funny. And so we go, yeah, we'll show you. And so Bob started doing Tony Clifton, and he did all the performances, like he was on Letterman, he was on all these shows, and everyone thought it was Andy, but it was actually Bob Zamuda, so joke's on them. Even when Tony Clifton played in Harris, and it was Bob Zamuda.
It's so weird to think about. I don't think anybody could do something
like that.
It's
Oh,
not
God. No, I know, you can't, no, you couldn't get away, well, there was no internet, it was just, you could do stuff like that. And
Any other questions?
Okay, I'm hesitant on asking this question because I'm not trying to get a scoop or anything.
Well, I might not answer.
Okay, well, they recently announced that they're making a film about the beginning of Saturday Night Live. And the first episode, curious if you are familiar with it or if there's any sort of casting for
I don't know. I actually don't know.
So
But Andy was on the very first Saturday Night Live.
Yeah, he was.
Yeah,
He was.
and George Carlin was the host, and Andy Kaufman came out and did the Mighty Mouse. And that's,
Right, that's that famous moment.
Can you imagine? Come
Yeah.
on. So yeah, sorry, I have no idea about that.
From 82 to 83, while he was wrestling, what kind of touring would he do in between? And were there any other comedians or other minds besides Bob Zamuda that he actually liked collaborating with or that stood out to him? No?
He didn't collaborate with anybody except Bob. That was it. And between 82 and 83, trying to think, it was all just going to Memphis and wrestling. because not much was going on. I mean, he might, that might be when, I'm not sure when he did that Friday show.
If you don't know what she's referencing with Friday's Fight, Google Friday's Fight on YouTube.
It's also there's a new movie that they haven't sold it yet. It's called Thank You Very Much. It's a documentary about Andy that I was one of the producers on, and that is in it, and it's really good because it actually, instead of just showing one clip after another of his performances, they look at Andy and what created Andy, because it's like, what created that guy, you know? It's like, what made him the way he was? And so Thank You Very Much, when it finally gets sold, it has a lot, doesn't answer any questions, so.
He was a devout TM.
Yes, he was a devout TMer, transcendental meditation.
I mean, in a way, it's so weird, right? The whole thing is so strange. What drove him to really want to do this? I mean, you were there at the time.
Yeah.
So, I mean, okay, so he watched this as a kid. Lots of us have watched stuff as a kid. What is it that drove him to want to do that?
The director of this film I was just talking about, and I discussed that to no end, like what made him become that way.
Yeah.
And a lot of it was, he was very shy and withdrawn, and when he was a kid, he put on shows in his bedroom thinking there was a camera in the wall. This is all true, I think a lot of it was in reaction to, because the one thing he loved, the reason he liked wrestling, the reason he liked certain films, it was always the guy who's so happy and friendly in public, but the minute the camera's off, he's a real asshole. He's a real jerk, And that was Andy's whole modus operandi, is that the right word? And that's why he liked wrestling, being the bad guy wrestler. And I take a lot of it back to his dad, I think, because his dad, I think, yelled a lot and made Andy, retreat into his room. And I think a lot of the bad guy wrestler stuff was his dad and Tony Clifton.
One thing I've heard, this is just heard through the rumor mill, is that he had wanted to feel what it was like to have 8 or 10 or 5,000 people boo him too, and that he thought in wrestling that was one of the few ways he could do it.
But why did he want that?
Why
did he want that?
Maybe just the visceral feeling of.
Yeah.
I don't know, but when it happened, that's when he felt his best, is when people were booing at him and yelling at him, and that was his happy place.
And it really was.
Yeah, really, yeah. But it was an act, it was all part of an act, so it was a happy place within an act.
Was there anyone on the Taxi cast that he was closer to?
Yeah, Mary Lou. Yeah, she loved him. We used to go out with her all the time, and she actually loved him, and Danny DeVito loved him too. What's his name? Tony Day discuss. He hated him. I remember one time we were in the dressing room, we were meditating, and they're all out. Andy had it written into his contract that he only had to be there for the dress rehearsal. The rest of the cast was there all week with a stand-in for Andy. And Andy had one of those brains, he just memorized the script, so he only had to be there for the dress rehearsal, so they're all pissed off anyway. And then there was dress rehearsal, and they were out there waiting for him, and he's in there meditating, and Dancer was going, God damn it, he's pounding on the door, Andy, you asshole, get out of here. And Andy has this little smile on his face while he's just sitting there, It's like, and Judd hated him too, he won't admit it, but Judd hated him, and what's his name who was on there?
Jeff Conway.
Jeff Conway really hated him.
Kaneki from Greece. Right?
What's that?
Kaneki from Greece.
Yeah, they just hated him because they all had to be there, and Andy didn't. He got special treatment,
Any other questions?
Makes me laugh.
We're never gonna figure anything out.
I gotta ask, Christopher Lloyd, what was his take?
I don't know. Christopher Lloyd is I met him again when we made Man on the Moon, and he's a very, keeps to himself. He keeps to himself. I remember trying to talk to him on the set of Man on the Moon, and he was very Syllabic, thank you, monosyllabic. He's not real talkative. So I have no idea about him. Who else was there? That was it. Oh, Carol Kane loved him. That's
You
right.
were working
Carol
on
Kane
the
loved
questions.
him.
That's great.
You mentioned at when he was on Letterman with Jerry Lawler, he's wearing the neck brace.
Yeah.
And he, gets in an argument with him, he storms off the stage. And he then comes back on and he shouts,
obscenities.
Yeah, and throws the coffee on him. Was he going to come back on? Did he plan that? Do you know?
No, he didn't.
Because that's one of the most magical moments.
He didn't plan it. He didn't plan it. And he and Lawler didn't really plan that, they just knew they were gonna do, like Lawler says he knew Andy wanted him to do something, but he didn't know quite. And Letterman now says he knew it was gonna happen, but he didn't.
Oh, man.
He claims he did, but he didn't. Yeah, if you can ever see that footage, it's amazing. And the footage before they bleep him, the very first time it's on TV, they didn't bleep it. And Andy came out and excuse my language and going, "You motherfucker, I'm gonna fucking kill you, I'm on live TV."
And I think that's June of 1982 or so when that happens.
You can still read his lips.
He was fully a full star at that point. It's unbelievable.
Oh yeah, he was a huge
that.
star.
Yeah.
That's what's amazing.
Fairly recently, they had the Jim and Andy documentary coming on the Netflix.
The what?
Jim and Andy, the doc.
The Jim Carrey
Oh, the
documentary.
Jim Carrey thing. That's all my footage, by the way.
Yeah.
Just want to brag, that's all my behind the scenes footage.
Was that kind of, right, was that a bit of kayfabe on Carrey's part with it and the whole documentary aspects, or like an ode to Andy in a sense?
It was an ode to Andy, and Jim, he's not like a character actor who has to stay in character, but he realized it would really be fun to stay in character, and Jim really did. He stayed in character through the entire 4 months of filming. He was either Andy or Tony Clifton, and all the crew, Milos, everyone had to call him Tony or Andy. Like Jim only showed up on the set one day when Andy and Tony weren't on. Jim showed up as Jim and said, "Man, I heard there's all this shit going on." So yeah, he stayed in character through the whole thing.
That's great.
And I still have like a deformed shoulder from holding the video camera for 100 hours.
Well, thank you, those were good footage.
Yeah, I had a blast, because Samuda was there too, we had a blast. Everyone else, the line producer hated me, because I was sticking my camera in everybody's faces. Oh my God, he hated me.
Any other questions?
Kick us out when you want us out.
I think we can go on.
A mat at home?
Yes, he had a wrestling mat.
Who was he wrestling?
Any woman he could get to come over.
At home?
Yeah.
We'll put a plug in. Wrestling at home was like a thing.
It was because he got real turned on wrestling women. Let's say it that way. And what was funny is, we'll bring this up, is when I was 19, way before I met Andy, and I used to they have this thing in wrestling magazines called apartment wrestling, and it's 2 women in bikinis wrestling. I don't know if any of you have ever seen that, but I used to do that. And so I was in some of the magazines, and after we met, he went back and went through his magazines. I was like, oh my God. Actually, he was very, very, very proud of me for that.
If you're interested in apartment wrestling, Google Exquisite Mayhem when you get home. It is Tashin put out a book of the photographer Theo Eric in Los Angeles, who was an incredibly well-known photographer. But
and I made $50 every time I did it.
He was responsible for apartment wrestling, and they produced a beautiful book of
I gotta look and see if I'm in there.
It's absolutely amazing, and I recommend it.
Trixie.
Was that your wrestling name?
Oh no, but that's what they named me in one of the magazines. I was Trixie. Yeah.
This is a whole long story, because there was a whole industry, not even just of the photos, but in the magazines, writers would write every month invented stories.
Big old story.
And it was like a 6-page spread of women wrestling, and then there was a story to accompany it. It's absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
It's a whole world. But yes,
It's
Andy
a whole
wrestled
world.
women at home. Yes.
Yeah. And then one time we were in New York, and one of the magazines I was in was at the newsstands, and there was a little inset at the top of with a picture of me wrestling. And Andy was so proud, he bought the whole stack, and they didn't want out hawking them on the streets. with me, going, here she is, the star, Trixie.
Without getting too academic about it, it is kind of strange because even if you notice back then, that was one of the few places you could go and see people without their clothes on in some respects. Like these were gigantic men, you couldn't see anywhere else. No one looked like that, right? And then for men, it was almost like an acceptable form of, it wasn't like you had to buy a Playboy. It was kind of in these wrestling magazines.
I
And there
never
was
thought about
something,
that, about the men who would like
there
seeing
was
the men
something
too.
strangely
Erotic.
about the whole thing. And wrestling,
Right.
early wrestling films, it was like a, yeah.
Oh, I did a couple of
There's a
Asian
lot
women
there.
wrestling films
Yeah,
too.
there's a lot to be dissected.
One was of cave girls, I remember I wore furs.
All right, any other questions?
You're the closest we're ever gonna get to asking Andy Kaufman any question.
It's true, I know.
So, he was asking about the motivation for this character as an antagonist, and to us, we understand that, and we say, oh, we should not behave that way. That's uncivilized. But to many people who are motivated, God knows why, or nobody knows why.
Dog knows why.
Dog knows why. Look up to Andy Kaufman. Like Elon Musk probably excuses some of his behavior because he's being Kaufman-esque.
Interesting.
Likewise, many right-wing assholes might, oh, I'm just being joking. I'm totally halfway joking. I'm just joking about
Right.
religion.
I wish.
Do
But you know, when Trump first showed up on the scene, there was a rumor that it was Tony Clifton.
And that's what I mean.
Yeah.
Well, he's connected to wrestling. I mean, there was that
Yeah.
footage, right? Of
Who?
the-
Oh, yeah, Trump was
Recently.
part of the
Yeah,
wrestling.
Trump's there. Him and Vince.
Yeah.
There's a rumor that the only person that they would clear the Oval Office for was Vince McMahon.
Is this the long con? Trump in
Yeah.
bed is Andy Kaufman?
Yeah, yeah. There was that rumor. There's a picture, if you look for it, there's a picture of Trump, they're unzipping him and Andy Kaufman is
I
inside.
am looking forward to that moment.
Yeah. God, me too.
I have spent a lot of time thinking about this one. The only thing I will say about it though is that this is consequence-free stuff. This is entertainment.
Right.
Yeah.
When you're doing it now, co-opting it to, assert people of their civil rights is a different thing.
Amazing, thank you.
And so that's where I see the difference.
It wasn't totally consequence-free for Andy, because it did sort of ruin his career, all of the antagonizing stuff.
Yeah.
But it was just pure entertainment to him. The madder people got, the more he enjoyed it.
But
So, maybe less a question and more like, are you aware that about 10 years after Andy Kaufman did all of this, Vince McMahon went to Memphis and did exactly the same
No, in Memphis?
Absolutely, exactly the same.
I hate him.
He did the same program.
Really?
And it was how he kind of, with Dick Ebersol's help, actually, it's how he taught himself to be the Mr. McMahon character that became the villain of 90s wrestling.
No, I didn't know that.
Jerry Lawler claims in his autobiography that McMahon kind of said as much, that he based his whole character, that he, when he went, this is a lot of wrestling stuff for some people, but when he went into, when McMahon crossed into becoming an actual wrestler, performer thing, he played a character called Mr. McMahon, which was effectively, he was
But he
doing
based it on what?
He was
Oh,
doing
Andy?
Andy, yeah.
Asshole.
That was fairly close to after the steroid trial, right?
93.
So Jared went to help him during that moment, so that's probably another.
Interesting.
We have
No,
gone down the
I
rabbit
didn't
hole.
know that.
We have crossed
Hey,
through
they're here for your
the
wrestling books,
That's true,
man.
yeah.
It's like, what
There's
else
a-
are we gonna talk
that-
about?
You
yeah.
found your people.
Yeah, people.
Yeah, so it was one of the last time for wrestling fans that it really did blur that line.
Interesting, and that was, when did they tear the Mid-South Coliseum down?
It's still up.
Oh, I thought they tore it down.
Yeah, no,
It's just closed. Sad.
Jerry
It kinda made
Lawler,
me sad watching this, cause it's also, it's gone.
they ran that
Gone.
place Monday night, every Monday night for probably close to 30 years.
And then the Saturday studio, small, tiny little studio on Saturdays, yeah.
All right, everybody, thank you for your time. Thank you for coming here.